My talk today draws on my last book, which is Utopianism for a Dying Planet, Life After Consumerism. I should perhaps stress what comes after the colon, which was published last year. The narrative which I present there is a global one, and I can't get at some of the specific British and American components of this, which is what I agreed to talk about, without giving you a brief overview of the grand theme. So here it is. As the most recent but toned down IPCC report of March of this year, offered as a final warning, reiterates, climate catastrophe and collapse, no longer change or crisis, now looms before us. On my reading, much of the debate concerning what we face is wholly inadequate. Vague goals of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming appear in the daily news, but emissions continue to rise, while $1 trillion annually is given in fossil fuel subsidies to ensure that we surpass any acceptable limit on global warming. 1.5 degrees warming, a so-called target, which was never, ever a back-of-the-envelope calculation, if ever there was one, was never the least bit a safe goal, will likely be passed by the mid-2020s. At 1.5 degrees, 4 tipping points will likely be reached: the rapid thaw of the boreal permafrost, collapsing ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica, and the extinction of the coral reefs. At 2 degrees warming, meaning 3 degrees Celsius average on land, by perhaps the early 2040s, most of our agriculture will disappear, and in a few years, mass starvation and the ensuing chaos will eventually kill perhaps 90% of our current population. If anything, that's an underestimate, I think. We could look at complete annihilation. Much of what Europe will be is what the Sahara is today. Most bees expire at a temperature of 45 degrees Celsius, and we will only survive their death by 4 years. So 2 degrees warming is pretty much the end of things. Think then of where we are now, with only 1.2 to 1.3 degrees Celsius rise. Think of the shrinking Rhine, the Danube, the Po, the Loire, the Colorado, the Ganges, the Mississippi, and the Yangtze. Think of ocean temperatures, the polar ice caps, and the world's glaciers. We may dispute when these will disappear, the latter, but that they are evaporating is beyond doubt. Fossil fuel use, subsidized to the tune of $3.8 trillion since the Paris Agreement of 2015, the usual benchmark, is the chief cause, of course, of this process. And behind this lies, you see as I move to my theme here, the overconsumption of the world's resources. Fossil fuel corporations were well aware of these eventualities as early as the 1970s. So the warming process must be halted, then reversed. But instead, 2022 witnessed a world record in coal consumption. 2023, new coal plants are still opening, and $200 billion in profit for the largest 5 fuel corporations. Methane bombs, as they're called, threaten vastly greater destruction than hitherto suspected. Oil production, too, continues to expand. And there's enough ice in Greenland and Antarctica for 65 meters of sea rise, should it all melt. Yet the first and most immediate great crisis already looming before us will be water shortage. Soon after will come famine and the failure of food supplies, and then decivilization will commence in earnest. But the Earth does not have a thermostat which can be set arbitrarily at a certain temperature. The warmer it gets, the warmer it is likely to get, which is why the increase in rapidity of warming is perhaps the most notable feature of observing these facts over the last 30 years. So that's the premise I offer you. We're facing unmitigated catastrophe. Now, to some of the ways in which history might assist us to frame a solution to these problems. You all read in most of the papers and on televisions on every day about the problems themselves. Solutions are out there, but they're much harder to come by and tend to be thin on the ground. So much then for the general scenario facing us, which we seem so desperately and so naturally to deny. But for most of us, visions of the apocalypse, with a capital A, and staring into the dystopian abyss are nothing new. But nobody likes what's called doomism in English, just saying this is the way it is, and as a cri de coeur, a cry of despair, not offering a solution. So let's turn to some of the paths we have taken to reach our current crisis and might take to save ourselves from what we face. How should climate social scientists and historians, as opposed to climate scientists, assess where we are now and use their knowledge to avoid this fate? It will be immediately evident to all of you, I hope, that any narrative respecting overconsumption in the 20th and 21st centuries will have to reckon with the luxury debates of the preceding centuries, which spanned all the major European countries and briefly spilled over to North America and elsewhere. I want to deal with these debates in terms of the three faces of utopianism, as they're often termed: utopian ideas, intentional communities, and utopian fiction. How have each of these treated what will emerge to be my central theme today, luxury? As you're well aware, no doubt, the founder of the utopian literary tradition was Thomas More, whose 1516 text prominently depicted the natives of the island of Utopia as hostile to vain display and what Thorstein Veblen would later call conspicuous consumption. The children of Utopia mock ambassadors from foreign lands who, as More tells us, quote, wore cloth of gold with gigantic necklaces and earrings of gold. They had gold rings on their fingers and sparkling strings of gems and pearls hung from their caps. In short, they were dressed exactly the way the utopians dressed slaves to punish them, wrongdoers to disgrace them, and children to amuse them. We recognize today, of course, that it is a naive reading of More's text to assume that the utopians do not value gold, for they store it carefully to pay their mercenaries in the service of imperial conquest. Yet their contempt for personal adornment is, to an important degree, defines the entire tradition which More founds. Utopian fiction, theory, and literature have alike recognized the unhappiness which results from an obsession with luxury, and all have evinced, strikingly, a Spartan tradition of austerity, asceticism, and primitivism. Whether the scenario depicted is an ideal past or golden age, a lost island in tropical climes, or further away still in the realm of science fiction, space typically, social and political degradation through luxury has been a familiar utopian theme. In the 18th century, it was often the British followers. I've been asked to speak of Britain and the US here, so I'm not saying a great deal about France, which I say about in the book. It was the British followers of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like William Godwin, who championed such views. Writers like James Burr took up the Harringtonian tradition of an agrarian law to urge a limit upon landed property in order to prevent excessive social inequality. And Sparta loomed large as a possible model of the future egalitarian society. By the late 19th century, however, we reach an era in which a perceptible shift occurs from private to public luxury and away from the Spartan model. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, published in 1888 in particular, rejected the colony approach, as Bellamy calls it, to the ideal society, and proposed instead a highly centralized, urban, statist organization of labor, with mandatory industrial armies for most and equal wages. But private luxury has given way to that of the public. And here we encounter a powerful exposition of how this might work, the most important such in the utopian tradition. Now what Bellamy calls the splendor of our public and communal life, as compared with the simplicity of our private and home life, is presented as, Bellamy again, the contrast which in this respect the 20th century bears to the 19th century. To save ourselves useless burdens, Bellamy continues, we have as little gear about us at home as is consistent with comfort. But the social side of our life is ornate and luxurious beyond anything the world ever knew before. During the intervening period, a substantial debate had taken place in Britain, as of course in France, respecting the relative advantages or not of the luxury trade and luxury consumption. While the appeal of simplicity recurs frequently as a social theme from the 17th through the late 20th centuries, it is generally conceded that the triumph of what may be termed, often is, unsocial sociability occurred by the early decades of the 19th century, when the social effects of luxury were vindicated by their fomenting of economic growth in general, and the older, both classical and Christian, moralistic debate about luxury grew ever less important. Scenario, of course, all of us recognize today. The key event here was the explosion of luxury consumption, which occurred in the late 18th century, Paris, of course, notably one of its centers, which introduced down through the social ranks, and this is something contemporaries note time and time again, the confusion of ranks which appears in this period, which we therefore now characteristically associate with modernity as such. The vain efforts of the past half millennium or longer to enforce sumptuary laws regulating the personal adornment with luxury goods and consumption of luxury goods in order to ensure publicly visible distinctions in social rank, which were, of course, enormously important in medieval and early modern Europe, were now thrown aside. Billionaires today dress just like us. They're just like the common man and woman, aren't they? Now, as Istvan Hunt stresses, 18th century theorists like David Hume and Adam Smith only feared luxury when it was so-called unregulated. If it was well ordered, in the view of Hume and Smith, and brought more polished manners, or what we today usually term civilization, this could justify the much greater inequality of property which accompanied such commerce. A key text here in Britain was Bernard Mandeville's The Fable of the Bees of the early 1720s, which most clearly foreshadowed Veblen's later idea of conspicuous consumption. To Mandeville, savage society was precarious, fraught with terror, and what Mandeville calls a state of simplicity in which man can have so few desires and no appetites roving beyond the immediate call of untaught nature. Subsequently, by contrast, as Mandeville puts it, the restless industry of man to supply his wants and his constant endeavors to ameliorate his condition upon earth have produced and brought to perfection many useful arts and sciences. So that's the general line we've all adopted from this time onwards, and from now on, pursuing luxury becomes, by and large, viewed as a great motor force of civilization. The path from exonerating luxury to the excessive consumption of the late 20th and early 21st century and the looming destruction of the planet before us now is a familiar one to us. Yet there were some dissenting voices who doubted that this narrative of the continual expansion of production could be sustained. Let me briefly consider one lone British voice here, firstly from the liberal camp, John Stuart Mill, and then return briefly to some more explicitly utopian trends, because nobody else treats Mill, besides me, I think, as a utopian. Mill is, of course, best known for the defense of the concept of liberty, which is often mistaken as heralding modern libertarianism, the philosophy of state of Silicon Valley, of course. For our purposes, however, he was also a utopian writer in several key senses. and for our purposes, one of the most important, given his influence. Crucially for us, in Chapter 6, Book 4 of his Principles of Political Economy of 1848, acknowledging that, quote, the increase of wealth is not boundless, Mill proposed the first positive vision of a stationary state, his phrase here. Though he didn't invent it, here the qualitative improvement of life would take priority over economic growth. Crucial to state that this is a so-called classic liberal figure. Hitherto, the stationary state had been a kind of bogey for economists, as it remains by and large today, implying stagnant wages, demand, and population growth. Mill instead projected a condition where wealth production and population no longer increased, terming this, quote, a very considerable improvement on our present condition. I confess I am not charmed with the ideal of a life held out by those who think that the normal state of human beings is that of struggling to get on, that of trampling, crushing, elbowing, and treading on each other's heels, which form the existing type of social life, and regard this as the most desirable lot of humankind. Continuing, Mill wrote that the best state for human nature is that in which, while no one is poor, no one desires to be richer, nor has any desire to fear being thrust back by the efforts of others to push themselves forward. Here, under a better state of distribution, where inheritance would be sufficiently limited to require all to work, a liberal utopia was possible. A more visible trend of hostility to luxury was evident in many of the so-called intentional communities, or what I term here realistic utopias, created across this period, where we encounter many examples of aversion to and abstinence from excessive personal adornment, dress, and decoration. Among the religious communities, where of course we might typically expect it, we might point to, for example, the pietist Amana colony in Iowa, where frivolity was severely frowned on. Cards, games, dancing, and musical instruments, except flutes, were banned, shades of the Taliban. At meals, men and women were separated to, quote, prevent silly conversation and trifling conduct, which is half the fun of life to many of the rest of us. Women could not wear jewelry and had to dress drably and to wear black caps. Additional rules included injunctions for men to, quote, fly from the society of womankind as much as possible, as a very highly dangerous magnet and magical fire, and for all to avoid dinners, weddings, feasts. At the best of these there is sin, and, quote, constantly to practice abstinence and temperance so that you may be as wakeful after eating as before. The shaking Quakers, or Shakers too, as they're called, feared pleasure and made their resistance to things of the flesh extend to many areas. Eating was made boring by cutting food into squares. Try this at home. And musical instruments, again, were prohibited. After photography was invented, pictures of individual members were discouraged as promoting vanity, idolatry, and disunity. Amongst more modern communes, the strong bonds of a common faith, piety, and devotion eliminate or diminish many obstacles which endanger the outside world. As a result, the overwhelming ethic, which has been described for many of these, is, quote, production in the service of the community, not conspicuous consumption for leisure and personal pleasure. The Mennonites, for example, amongst the most successful of the religious sectarians, there are still about 2 million of them, affect plain dress, though ties, shoes, skirt length, and the use of color have been controversial issues in recent decades. Jewelry and photography are prohibited amongst them, and commercial entertainment like golf or bowling is discouraged. The Amish, well known to many, forbid all forms of makeup as encouraging personal vanity. Ornamentation and bright colors are generally prescribed. Decorating buildings is not allowed. Large mirrors, statues, photographs, and wall paintings are out. Weddings are kept simple and no names can be attached to gifts. Yet the Amish are, by all accounts, a very gregarious people who probably spend considerably more time visiting their neighbors than do most outsiders. Common worship and the need for mutual assistance, they live, of course, in the countryside, in agriculture especially, play central roles here. But pride, conceit, self-exaltation, luxury, excessive ease, indiscipline, and an obsession with looks or ostentation are everywhere suppressed. The fast pace of this world, to use the phrase of one, is avoided through a deliberate slowness and refraining from, quote, time-saving devices. A very alien world to our mentality. Amongst the more secular, and especially the socialist communities of the 19th century, we similarly encounter at best a muted toleration of personal distinction based on luxury display. To many early 19th century British socialists, fashion was a key target. In 1820, Robert Owen, founder of this group, thought, quote, that fashions will exist but for a very short period, and then only amongst the most weak and silly part of the creations, clearly misogynistic. In future, all things, quote, will be estimated by their intrinsic worth. Nothing will be esteemed merely for its cost or scarcity, and fashions of any kind will have no existence. The debt here, clearly to Puritan traditions, is pretty obvious. Owen viewed his first communal experiment at New Harmony, Indiana, from 1824 to 28, as an exercise in personal as well as collective frugality, reducing his meals to 2 per day and rejecting changes of fashion in apparel. A decade earlier at New Lanark, he had devised a kind of toga for the boys, quote, somewhat resembling the Roman and Highland garb. Now, he thought, a costume, clothing is always important in all these communities. A costume of the best form and material that can be devised was preferable to what he called the waste of capital, materials, and labor, the loss of health, the deterioration of intellect, and the immorality, which the manufacture and use of perpetually changing fancy dresses. Some members did sport a distinctive attire, with pantaloons for both sexes, with women adding a knee-length jacket. What was intended as a gesture towards equality, everything always backfires in these communities, it seemed, became a cliquish distinction when the intellectuals, calling themselves the literati, took to wearing these clothes as, quote, a badge of aristocracy. Owen's main socialist rival in the 1820s, the Irish landowner William Thompson, also wrote of all those extra articles of luxury called for by excessive wealth, and expected that under socialism, the term now coming into use in the mid-1820s, quote, the peculiar vices of luxury and want would almost cease. Note that the two bracketed together, luxury and want. The consumption of luxury produces excessive want. In the new communities, as Thompson put it, any motive for exertion arising from mere love of distinction, of excelling, of exciting envy by means of the individual accumulation of wealth, and thus attracting public sympathy, would simply disappear. Instead, objects of dress, elegance, luxury will be estimated, again as Owen had said, according to their intrinsic value, their real utility. A similar tendency was evident at the Ham Common Concordium outside London, founded by Amos Bronson Alcott, father of Louisa May Alcott, in 1838. This was initially overseen by the celibacy advocate, this is a shaking Quaker theme too, and so-called sacred socialist Alexander Pierpont Greaves, who warned of, quote, the tendencies of comforts and luxuries to soften the spirit, to weaken its self-command, and increase its sensibility to hardships and exposure. Again, the Spartan/puritanical themes aligned. This community lasted about 10 years. Here all rose between 4 and 6 and bathed in all weathers in cold water. Don't try this in a London winter today. The dress was plain and utilitarian, being, quote, a brown holland or cotton blouse, a neat check shirt without neckcloth or any other clumsy wrapper around the neck. The food was even plainer, since, quote, consuming flesh, butter, cheese, eggs, mustard, vinegar, oil, spices, beer, wine, tea, coffee, and chocolate was forbidden, with meals taken in silence. All slept on mattresses, it being considered that, quote, lying on feathers is both enervating and unhealthy, as well as relying on animal exploitation, something I imagine you never thought of before. One member thought, quote, that every step towards simplicity is good and has divine sanction, and thought the trend in the community ought to be from cooked to raw food. Some interesting contemporary alignments here. By 1844, indeed, nothing was cooked at all. And, quote, when the salt was conceded, it was concealed in paper under the plate, lest the sight of it should deprave the weaker brethren. Heaven help those who fall prey to the sight of salt. A visitor, the so-called pontifarch, as he called it, of the Communist Church, John Goodwin Barmby, thought a balance here might lie between fruit and vegetables in the summer and meat in the winter, with no alcohol unless it was home brewed or received as a gift. Interesting kind of way out of that conundrum. Yet we already observe amongst the Owenites an ambiguity respecting needs and wants which would foreshadow much later socialist debate. A broadly Puritan, here using it with a small letter, not capitalized, view of needs and consumption was adopted by many of the early Owenites. Some likened Owen's principles to those of Lycurgan Sparta, writing that any doubts about the correctness and practicability of the new views of society were entirely removed by reflecting upon the accordance of the whole with those principles which contributed to the establishment and prosperity of the Spartan government. The purpose of socialism, many assumed, was that it augments the productions useful to all by banishing luxury and idleness. Where modern means of production might provide greater plenitude, some socialists thought, however, no austerity might be necessary. The first prominent Owenite journalist and publisher, George Moody, writing in the 1820s, thought that as long as the system of rewarding labor was just, many so-called additional comforts and luxuries besides could be enjoyed in the new system. The sole proviso was that these should, quote, be attainable without interfering with the arrangements for the production of necessaries, and as attainable without, and should not require from them, a greater exertion of labor than is consistent with the rational enjoyment of life. An influential pamphleteer with Owenite leanings, John Gray, began in the 1820s with a marked prejudice against luxuries, arguing that a lace dress, for instance, symbol of luxury at the time, was, quote, useless. It can neither be eaten nor drunk, and it forms no part of useful wearing apparel. It is made only to please the fancy and to be looked at. It will not compare in point of real utility with a penny loaf or a glass of cold water. By the late 1820s, however, he shifted his emphasis to the limits which capitalist competition placed on demand, moving away from what he described, interestingly, as speculative theories about the perfectibility of man. He proclaimed instead the possibility of virtually unlimited production. Now, he thought, it was evident that in a properly, this is Gray, constituted society, one in which money should be of a rational kind, the demand for that which is ornamental, pleasing, and luxurious, including the fine arts in all their approved branches, must ever increase as fast as the increased powers of production, should enable a smaller proportion of the community to perform the more humble and laborious operations. By the end of this period, we note that in the 1890s, a pronounced ambiguity still exists in socialist traditions about luxury. Certainly in the contrast between Bellamy and Edward Bellamy and William Morris in News from Nowhere, and again then H.G. Wells in The Modern Utopia. So let me summarize briefly where we've gotten so far. Literary and practical utopians alike treated the themes of luxury and simplicity in three ways from the 18th until the early 20th century. Early on, many applauded a Spartan simplicity as the only condition conducive to virtue and equality. This option became much less common by the late 19th century, however, and the alternative which followed the renunciation of luxury in favor of a simpler and more virtuous life, a returning, as it was sometimes called, directly to barbarism, either voluntarily or ensuing upon the collapse of civilization, became rarer and rarer, displaced instead by an increasing emphasis, most prominently in Bellamy, who is far and away the most influential socialist utopian writer in the late 19th century. So there were variants on all of these, but there are a few writers, certainly, who still plump for simplicity over luxury. One thinks here, again, in the British and American traditions in the 1880s in particular, of the influence of Edward Carpenter, of Henry David Thoreau, for whom frugality or neo-Spartan utopianism now appears appealing again, and for the movement so-called for a simpler life. By 1900, then, three major arguments against luxury, and I'm moving forward thinking about our own conundrums, had largely gone into remission. Firstly, that it was intrinsically harmful to personal, moral, as well as civic public virtue, an argument pretty much alien to the later moderns. That it reduced the amount of agricultural labor unduly, thus producing want and famine, which doesn't occur to us at all, and that it entailed too much additional labor on the poor. Again, a non-issue for us. Machines, about which one could say much more. Marx, Wells, and many others, starting with John Gray at least, had surmised, could now take up the most onerous tasks. Consuming luxury was not dangerous as such, provided none were rendered for the socialists and utopians poorer or had to work harder as a result. In addition, utopia was now projected firmly into the future rather than being an ideal past or a quaint and curious place like Tahiti for Bougainville and Diderot and so on, which one reaches after a lengthy voyage. Utopia is now firmly in the future for most of those writing after the 1880s and Bellamy in particular. The ideas proposed by the simple lifers, as they come to be called by the 90s, did not really begin to bear fruit, however, for about a century. For by the late 20th century, particularly in the Anglo-American world, the idea of unlimited consumerism, the throwaway society, so singularly linked to the United States in particular, and the mass embrace of luxury had seemingly become irreversible and irrepressible. The trend was greatly exacerbated by the tax cuts and trickle-down economics of the Reagan-Thatcher era. By 2019, the great inequality which resulted was overtly obvious everywhere. 1% of the US population owns as much wealth as 90% of the rest of the population, by compared to the 1980s, where a third had that proportion of the nation's wealth. Globally, 1% now own more than 99% of the rest of the world's population, and 8 people, 6 of them Americans, are as wealthy as the poorest half of the planet's entire population. And the appetite of this elite for luxury consumption, as you read about practically every day in the papers, and the rest of the world's desire to emulate them remains undiminished. Globally, however, of course, also the richest 1% produce double the greenhouse gas emissions of the poorest 50%, with 10% generating as much as the other 90%. A quarter of the world's global emissions are in the United States. The catastrophic effects for our planet, which I outlined earlier of unlimited desires are now all too evident. So let me draw these threads together by way of conclusion. It's manifestly clear that we can see an Anglo-American model of consumption emerging from the late 18th century, which, having absolved consumerism from any significant moral consequences, led to a more selfish, self-centered, guilt-free experience of consumption than was usually the case elsewhere and beforehand. Similarly, however, the Anglo-American tradition also produced the first influential model of the preference for public over private luxury, in Edward Bellamy in particular, and offers copious examples of a more Spartan and austere tradition of utopianism in both secular and religious communitarianism. We stand today, however, at a crossroads in which the peculiarity of the Anglo-American neoliberal model and the greater excessive consumption of both nations presents a peculiar challenge to the present. This model, notionally representing greater freedom, now implies primarily a freedom to destroy the planet in the name of fossil fuel profits. It is clear that we must reject this model completely and comprehensively and urgently shift course dramatically. Yet we remain desperately in denial and largely unwilling to confront the fact that our climate narrative is almost completely shaped by right-wing and fossil fuel interests in particular. However, I'm not here to offer you a magic performance. I have no utopian white rabbit to ease gently from a top hat, or a magic wand to whisk away our problems, or any vain and deluded promise of space colonization to save the worthy few billionaires able to afford it, Mr. Musk's pet scheme. But it would be bad manners to define a problem and to explore its historical parameters only to take refuge in the past, with a plea that a mere historian can at best understand where we have come from, while only prophets can succumb to the temptation to foretell the future. I think, to the contrary, that what the future has to offer us is bleakly obvious. But I also think that we must venture to contemplate solutions to ensure that that future is not so starkly dystopian and apocalyptic as it now appears to be. And the last third of the book, which I'm not going to address this afternoon, proposes some solutions. The transition to sustainability, then, will be driven by the widespread realization that things are really as bad as I have described them to be today. Scenes akin to those we might have witnessed, some there did, in May '68, or more recently in the streets around us here at the Sorbonne, will then become commonplace until fossil fuel-funded governments are overturned. This is going to happen one way or the other. A radical Green New Deal can then be implemented, which will sharply reduce all forms of non-sustainable production and consumption until the warming process has been stabilized. We can see here how far utopian traditions of voluntary simplicity and a contempt for conspicuous consumption could assist us. A counterculture akin to that of the 1960s, there's a chapter on this here, may well help to provide us with a new model of sociability in which we exchange the excessive consumption of things for stronger bonds between individuals. And that is the single most salient theme of the book as a whole. The exchange of sociability for an adherence to the consumption of things. But as much as anything else, a post-consumerist society will rely upon recreating and strengthening the immediate bonds of locality in order to intensify our sense of belonging, togetherness, and neighborliness. The feeling of belongingness is crucial to the utopian tradition. Indeed, in my interpretation, which is outlined in the first third of the book, perhaps its central feature. Here in Paris, we have seen the most important attempt to introduce the so-called 15-minute city, where all basic amenities are within walking distance of one's home. This neighborhood-centered approach, in my view, is essential for creating a sustainable future. There is much farther to go, of course, but this utopian concept is within reach, and it is now up to us to grasp it. Thank you.